What is going on, y'all? KMBest here, fresh off of hours and hours spent with my boo, Infinity Ultron. We're going to talk about the best decks to play this card. We're going to talk about whether this card is worth purchasing, but first, let's just take a look at what the card actually does. Infinity Ultron is a 5/6 with an on-reveal ability that adds 2 of Ultron's special Infinity Stones to hand. That means that he's a card with a great deal of variance, and at 5/6, his stats aren't always necessarily enough to pay you off for putting the cards in your hand that you're not actually going to use. In other words, this card is good when you get the right stones, but it can run into trouble by being a 5/6 body when you get stones that you aren't actually equipped to make use of. And unfortunately, there are several of those. So let's take a look at what each stone does. Infinity Power Stone is a 3/2 with an on-reveal ability that doubles Ultron's power. This is, as they say, the good one. This is the one that is part of almost every combination that makes Infinity Ultron worth playing. If you could guarantee that one of the stones was always going to be this card would be dramatically better, although it would be a fair bit more predictable. Part of the upside of having this is that it's very difficult to sort of guess that your opponent is going to play this double up to 12 or 24 depending, and Shang-Chi in the correct lane. It's very hard to blow up an Infinity Ultron because of the inherent variance of, if they don't actually play the Power Stone, I don't actually hit anything with my Shang-Chi. This is, in my opinion, the linchpin of Ultron's kit, and it is far from what is letting him down, if anything is. This is the other one that is quite good. At 3/1, the Infinity Reality Stone makes a drone, much like the original Ultron, and sets its power to Ultron's power. Power Stone and Reality Stone are a great combination. This will let you get Ultron up to 12 power, and then Reality Stone will make a 12 power dude. Very powerful final turn, legitimately. Unfortunately, here's about where things start going downhill. The Ultron Time Stone tends to be pretty bad, in part because when you play Infinity Ultron and you put him in your deck, you are choosing as a 5-cost that gives you cards that are going to be your final turn to say that you are not going to play a lot of big guys. Obviously, the Time Stone with its pseudo Jubilee effect pulling from the hand, maybe pseudo Isan is a better word to describe it, is a card that wants you to play big guys. That's not what Infinity Ultron wants you to do, and so you end up with a card that is very often just like pulling a 2/3 out of your hand and you feel stupid. This is another one that really lets you down a lot. This, of course, being the Infinity Space Stone, and it's like bad Polaris because you're playing this on the final turn of the game. They might fill up that location anyway. This is not a thing that is going to be realistic. The only thing notable about this stone, bluntly, is that it has 4 power, and like that can matter sometimes. Infinity Soul Stone, aka Elsa Bloodstone, plays like Elsa Bloodstone. You are generally going to be filling up lanes. This is not the world's worst card. Like, there are situations where this is like a 3/5, a 3/7, a 3/9 even, but it is very situational, and it's just not always an excellent thing to get. And I think by now you could see the downgrade from getting purple and red to getting pretty much any other combination. Infinity Mind Stone is Wong. There's cool stuff this can do, like doubling up the orange stone or whatever, but a Wong that you really are only ever playing on the final turn of the game is a really awkward part of this kit. You can do like double Power Stone stuff. That's okay, but if you do that, you better be doing something else also, either by ramping or by discounting these guys, because it's just not a lot of power outside of that. You're putting like 4 power on the board. It's not great. Now, Infinity Ultron does allow you to, like, buff his power, making Power Stone more relevant. So you'll see a lot of Infinity Ultron with Galacta to get him to 9. So 1 Power Stone is enough and you don't need to do 2 Power Stones. That's actually kind of legit. Like, this card is a card that I think realistically is a little bit on the low end of power, but it is very interesting in my opinion. Like, it's not as far off as people think. So when it comes to actually playing this card, what ultimately happens, in my opinion, is that you end up defaulting towards more actually consistent 5-drops. The problem with Ultron is that his body is pretty small and his output is unfortunately limited. If you get the right stones, that is obviously very strong. There are good combinations of stones. It's just there's a few more combinations of stones that are bad, or at least that are bad enough that you're not particularly interested in playing them on the final turn of the game, than there are stones that are good. And this is coming from someone who had like a 60% win rate with my Infinity Ultron decks. It's still a little bit iffy. I'll dive into this a little more towards the end of the video when we give our rating on this card and a general impressions. For now, let's take a look at the decks to play him in. This was my most successful build with Infinity Ultron. The idea here is that we're going to try to overlap Luna Snow and Agamotto and Infinity Ultron. Luna Snow is pretty good at getting fives out. One of the main things that Luna Snow can do better than Hope Summers, for example, is get a 5-drop onto the board, and that is what this is leaning into. Being able to 5-on-4 helps you just in case of Agamotto, but it also helps you in case of Infinity Ultron. This is a deck that plays Galacta. You are very interested in playing Galacta because it can make your Infinity Ultron stronger up to 9 power, suddenly making Power Stone a very real threat. But also, because on the later turns of the game, you are very interested in, if you are playing the stones, getting as much power on them as you can. Galacta takes your, like, let's say you're playing Power Stone and Mind Stone, that's usually 4 power in the non-Infinity Ultron lane. Galacta makes it 7, that's slightly more respectable. And so stuff like that is kind of what you're looking at here, but ultimately, a lot of the time, there were other overlaps, like Quinjet being a card that both Agamotto and Infinity Ultron can key off of, things like that. The fact that Kahori gets to be a little bit better because of Infinity Ultron. But ultimately, I would say that it felt like you were probably giving up more than you were gaining in order to get Infinity Ultron in the deck. I played this for like 60-something games. I did very well with it, or at least reasonably well. And I ultimately kind of think that just a normal Agamotto deck would have done about as well, if not better. And I think that that is ultimately where Infinity Ultron is going to land. That is going to be a refrain you hear a lot of. This is a card that is not worth the squeeze. The juice that you get out of it is not worth the effort that you're putting in, the squeeze. And so this card ends up feeling like it's not worth investing in a lot of the time. You end up in situations where, if you win the 1 in 6 and then the 1 in 5, or sorry, the 2 in 6 and then the 1 in 5, which I recall being about 7% to happen to get the right combination of stones, then suddenly it's a card that is worth playing a lot, but it's hard to commit to this guy. And I was kind of going out of my way to try to commit to this guy. And it felt like a lot of the time that I would be playing Infinity Ultron, I probably could have been playing something else that just isn't as RNG reliant for where its power is located. And this isn't even a problem that's like necessarily about him. It's about how bad some of his stones are. Like, even when they're 2 cost, some of these are legitimately poor. There's a bit of a tension between the fact that you kind of want to fill the board up for one of them, but you also want to have an empty space or 2 empty spaces if you want to do the reality stone. That tension rears its head a fair bit. Ultimately, this is a card that is powerful in sort of a very limited scope. And because the scope is so limited, I felt like a lot of the time, even risking a Shang-Chi, I'd rather just be playing like an Agamotto out there just because it's a more consistent big body. And I think that will come up a lot when you play Infinity Ultron decks, that the things he's asking you to do, you can win games with them. There's nothing against that, but there's probably other stuff that is going to be able to do it better. Like, here's a great example of a deck that Ultron has no issues going in. Like, this is a deck that's doing a lot of stuff that Ultron wants you to do. The problem is he's never your plan A. And so you have this as a thing where it's like, yeah, this is cool. If I'm not doing anything amazing, I can still scam out games with Infinity Ultron. And the deck is good. Like, this is already a good deck. You're not making it that much worse by putting Infinity Ultron in it. But I find it hard to believe you're making it better. Like, for example, this was the deck effectively that I was playing Kahori in. And I gotta tell you, I was a lot more successful with Kahori in that spot than I was with Infinity Ultron. So if you're looking for a baseline comparison, I think it would be safe to say, from my end at least, this is a card that currently is weaker than Kahori. Granted, I'm higher on Kahori than a lot of other people are. I think she's just a very solid card, and Infinity Ultron is sort of the opposite. Not that he's not incredibly solid or whatever. What I mean is Kahori is pretty much just going to be baseline 7 out of 10. That's sort of her floor. Infinity Ultron's floor is a 5/6 that puts cards in your hand that you don't play. And so his floor is so much lower, and his ceiling is not dramatically higher. And so you end up with a card, again, the juice not worth the squeeze. I've been seeing a lot of people play this deck. I'm not sure where it came from. I do think it's clever. I like the overlaps that are happening here. There are very fun little bits of overlap here, like Ravonna Renslayer discounts a couple of the stones. It also discounts Sage, and you can double it up with your Moonstone. You have your Iron Man. It's just like there's cool stuff here. I don't want to like dunk all over it, you know? There's cool stuff here, you know, double Quinjet. This is a deck that's going to get a lot of cheap stones and be able to play some powerful stuff, and I really don't want to understate it. But ultimately, it ends up going about this in a way that is fragile. But the upside of this deck is it's going about this in such an incredibly unexpected way. Like, when you play against this deck, there are so many things that could possibly happen. Of all of the decks that really try to weaponize range, Infinity Ultron doesn't have a lot of them yet, which is weird. Well, not that weird, it's day one. But it does seem like a card that would have a lot of decks that really weaponize range and confusion on the final turn of the game. And this is the closest I've seen to a deck that is legitimately trying to do that. Just maximum the discounts and then have just like, you get like saged into like, you know, double you get the Mind Stone and like Silver Surfer or whatever. Or you can like Mind Stone Sage. Again, this is all possible thanks to the magic of things like Moonstone, Quinjet, Ravonna Renslayer. Like all of that stuff sort of adds up into a very confusing and awkward final turn for your opponent. I kind of think that, like, in as much as the other decks are just chucking Infinity Ultron into something that already works, this is like an Infinity Ultron deck, and that is good. The bad news is I don't think it's good particularly. It's like an interesting and fine and unique thing, and frankly, if people refine this enough, it might be interesting. I like the way it's like so clearly built around the various stones. So like a bunch of different stones can be good for you. But ultimately, I do think it ends up either needing to be refined in order to get better or generally lacking power right now. The Sage stuff is really cool. Double Sage is super sick off of the Mind Stone. There's a bunch of cool stuff. Again, I really don't want to understate it. I do think this is the kind of thing where it's like worth keeping in mind and seeing if there's like some principles we can learn about building with Infinity Ultron and what that looks like. And this is closer to that than I've seen anything else yet. I do think that like if this card has a future, it's going to look more like this than the previous two decks because those were just him sort of dragging good decks down is my suspicion. Whereas this is a completely new thing that is very weird and definitely about him. Speaking of just jamming him in whatever, Arishem is a lot more able to afford just doing whatever with this guy. In as much as I think like sometimes he's making other decks maybe a little bit worse, especially the second deck we talked about. With Arishem, I actually think he might be just like a pretty good inclusion. The card raises the range of whatever deck he's played in. Arishem already has a pretty massive range, but that range has a low end wherein the cards you get can be awful. You can randomly generate cards in Arishem that are 50 times worse than the worst of this dude's Infinity Stones. And so for that reason, it's actually kind of nice to just be like, oh, I have some pretty okay cards. I'm already playing Quinjet. This is going to be kind of sick. I get something out of this at least. This is Emma's build, EMA, And I don't know exactly how I feel about the Doom stuff. I think that kind of stuff, like if there were flex slots in this deck, Doom 2099 and Doctor Doom versus, like, say, Alioth or Legion or something, right? Or Mobius and Mobius or whatever it is that you really want to feel like playing there. That is sort of where my head is at. The rest of this is just stock RSM. You are actually a deck that gets this card out on turn 4. So you get more flexibility with it. It compounds with your Quinjet and you do cool stuff that way. And also, yeah, your RSM. This card, I do think, is better in RSM than it is in a variety of other spots. I would not be surprised, unfortunately, if long term this ended up being his best home. Over the last few weeks, people have been talking a lot about Silver Surfer with Arshem. And I think, it's not the world's most unpredictable thing to look at, right? Like, he makes a bunch of threes, one of them is a Wong, and you're like, oh my god, I'm going to double Silver Surfer. I've got a PSA for you. 2 Silver Surfer procs isn't that good. It's not. If you're playing 4 power, but it's 2 Silver Surfer procs, it's just not that good. It can be that good, but it's, if you ask me, like, is that better than, like, Galacta into Brood? It just isn't. Like, this deck has higher power spikes than Infinity Ultron adds to it. And I am in favor, generally, of decks including cards that increase the range. I like that. But that seems to be the crux of why people are trying the Surfer stuff, and I gotta tell you, I just can't put it together in my head. It just does not make a ton of sense in the context of this deck. There's cool lines, like you get a turn 4 Sarah off a Luna, you get your Infinity Ultron down, you play some cool stuff, you can do stuff. It's just, that's okay. Like, it's okay. And it's not good enough that people need to tech against it. And if it was good enough that people needed to tech against it, it'd be very vulnerable to a bunch of stuff. And I just don't have a lot of faith in the Surfer stuff right now. So, is Infinity Ultron worth purchasing or worth 4-banging? My impression is that if you 4-bang for this card, you will likely be pretty upset. I had a bunch of games against, like, Scream decks and things like that where this card just felt woefully underpowered. I think once the metagame starts to really adjust, this is going to be a card that will fall out of favor fairly quickly. He is extremely cool. Like, I really cannot state that enough. This is a cool-ass card, and it's also kind of maybe in the buff range, would be my guess. Like, unlike some other fairly medium cards, this is a card that is cool and might be a little bit worse than some of the other stuff that's come out recently. This is close to a Firehair, I would say, where it's like they have very similar dynamics where the juice is not worth the squeeze. There are things that could change in the future. For Firehair, it's the context of not really having a second the hood. For this card, it's like, if there was a little bit more power on the bad stones, or they just did a little bit of different stuff, this would be a very reasonable card, because there are 2 of the stones that stand head and shoulders above the others, and you kind of get the others a lot more because that's how math works. There are 4 ones that you don't like and 2 that you really do. And so this is a card that ultimately, while it does offer a unique play experience, it needs to be ramped out in order to be good. And then it also kind of needs discounts on the stones. Again, it's asking too much of you for what it's offering from a competitive perspective. The card is not bad, or, like, I guess it is in the sense of, like, is this purchase going to win you games? I think I can conclusively say it will not. There are a wide variety of other cards that are far more likely to win you games. If you go spend 2 keys on this, you had better be damn sure you want this more than any other card in the game. Because, of course, on the 29th, we are getting the new economy. And when we get that new economy, 2 keys is 6,000 tokens. 6,000 tokens lets you go and pick any card in the entire game. For this reason, I do not think that opening caches for Infinity Ultron is a good idea. All of that is to say, I did still have a 60% win rate with the card. I think there's going to be a lot of people who were like, this card is ass, this card is terrible, it's the worst. It might be, but I do think it's a little bit early to say that. Like, this is a card that is weird and complex, and we don't really know all of the things it does just yet, or at least we don't really know the best way to build around it just yet. I wouldn't be surprised if it was terrible. I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up like an RSM staple. I'd be a little surprised if it ended up like a meta deck staple, because it would have to be in some form that I'm not aware of right now. But again, this is a game with live balance. Things change kind of all the time. I will say I did really enjoy playing this stuff. I tend to love decks that are just like randomly generating stuff and I can find my way through it. You might see a highlight on the Agamotto or Infinity Ultron deck tomorrow. I haven't really decided. I might do that. I might do hot takes. As always, I have been KM Best and you have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.